Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. As we have discussed previously in Mexico Centered, the problem of corruption in Mexico is one of the greatest challenges for the new administration of López Obrador. The problem is vast, widespread, and deep-seated in seemingly all governmental institutions. With corruption, or at least the perceptions and visibility of corruption greatly increasing during the previous 6 years, Mexican voters elected López Obrador in hopes of a cleaner government. According to a recent issue brief by Mexico Center's non-resident fellow Stephen Morris, the current state of affairs is, quote, clearly the nation's best opportunity in modern history to tackle corruption. What are the elements that create such an opportunity, and why are they present until today? What challenges remain, and can the López Obrador administration overcome them? Does López Obrador's leadership style help or hinder this fight? President López Obrador has continually emphasized the need to fix the corruption problem and believes he can do so. Will he? To tackle these questions, I called Stephen Morris. Stephen Morris is a non-resident fellow at the Mexico Center and a professor in the Department of Political Science at Middle Tennessee State University. In addition, Morris has a joint appointment to the Center for Latin American Studies at Vanderbilt University. His research has addressed political corruption and political reformism in Mexico, writing several books on the topic. Here's our conversation. Stephen Morris, non-resident fellow at the Mexico Center, thank you for this interview.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So here in Mexico Center, in the podcast, we have discussed the problem of corruption in Mexico. We have talked about the dimension of the issue, the different ways that we can think about corruption, like what kind of acts can be classified as corrupt. And we had also had Jacqueline Pichard as our guest before, who presided over the National Anti-Corruption System when it began. So corruption is clearly an important issue and a challenge that Mexico faces and the new administration of López Obrador faces. In your issue brief from last month, titled Mexico's Historic Opportunity to Fight Corruption, Changes, Challenges, and Opportunities, you write that today Mexico has the best conditions to fight corruption. So what is it that has changed since perhaps the year 2000, when the PRI was at last defeated in a presidential election? And why wasn't then the best opportunity to fight corruption?
Well, viewing it in kind of a historic context, because almost traditionally, when a new president comes to power, they bring in and begin kind of an anti-corruption campaign. So it's almost part of the normal rhythm of the Mexican sexenio, the 6-year presidential term. And as we've seen historically, that despite coming in with a lot of fanfare and a number of programs and a number of initiatives to try to fight corruption and even jailing some former officials, I mean, clearly the results have been minimal, to say the least. And I think the opportunity now, the situation is distinct at this moment, and that presents a lot of the opportunities to fight corruption and a lot of the challenges. I mean, it's not like it's going to be easy or anything like that, just because it's a good opportunity. And the reason I think it's a unique opportunity is, first of all, corruption has gotten to the point, or at least in the minds of the Mexicans, that it's reached kind of this crisis proportion, and due in large part to what was going on under the Peña Nieto administration, and particularly the immunity, the impunity that was seen with a lot of the corruption scandals during that period of time. I think it was more the corruption scandals than anything else. But corruption became the major issue. So it was not only the major issue for the leading presidential candidate and the victor in the elections, López Obrador, but also, according to exit polls, it was now deemed to be the most important issue by the voters. So that's really the first time that's happened. In addition to that, López Obrador has support not only among the people, which is important. He enjoyed a majority of the voters, but also he has substantial support in the Congress. So, in a sense, he has the political power, both with the public and in Congress, to be able to implement some reforms. And so anti-corruption he considers to be a priority issue, and he has in many ways the tools that he can hopefully address that issue. So that's a couple of things. The other thing two other things that I think are very important to make this a unique opportunity. One is that he comes to power with a newly created anti-corruption system in place. And this is unique because past presidents have come in and kind of created their own new system and put it in place with a lot of fanfare. They try to gain legitimacy through creating an anti-corruption program. But he comes to power with one already created, and it was created during the Peña Nieto period, although Peña Nieto really gets very little credit for the passage of the national anti-corruption system. So the issue for López Obrador, although there are some reforms that are needed and some additions that are needed to the new national anti-corruption system, there's something in place, something that strengthens the ability of the government to fight corruption. And so his task in many ways is to implement that rather than creating it. So that adds to it, I think. The final part of that is our final part of the opportunity, the unique historic opportunity, is that the national anti-corruption system was in large part the product of civil society organizations, NGOs, and almost sort of a social movement on fighting corruption. What makes that unique is that now Mexico, or López Obrador, begins his term fighting corruption with a kind of a mature and well-organized and attentive civil society focusing on corruption and anti-corruption. So again, viewing it from this perspective, that's unique compared to past anti-corruption programs in Mexico. In large part, in the past, presidents were able to kind of control and manipulate their anti-corruption programs. But in this case, López Obrador has an existing and active civil society organizations that are involved, that are attentive, and in some ways he'll have to coordinate with them. And the literature on corruption is quite clear. Not only do you need public support, but you also need these civil society organizations to play an important role in pressuring the government for accountability and maintaining the public's support in fighting corruption.
Right. So in this issue brief, you also discussed some challenges that López Obrador will face as his administration fights corruption. If the conditions are disfavorable, what are the challenges that remain?
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges. I mean, corruption, as the people have recognized and civil society recognized, it's a tremendous issue in Mexico. It's deeply entrenched. It is widespread, and it's an enormous task to try to take on corruption in Mexico. And so among the challenges he faces, some that I alluded to, one, he does have popular support for this. But one challenge is whether or not what he wants to do and how he's going to do it fits in with what the public wants. That can be somewhat difficult. Some of that centers on his idea of punto final, whether or not they should be investigating, go after past presidents. Certainly the public wants that. The public wants punishments, sanctions. So one of the challenges, too, is that, as I mentioned, rather than kind of creating with great fanfare and spectacle a new anti-corruption program, his challenge is to implement one that already exists. And a lot of that implementation centers on building state capacity, training investigators to investigate corruption, to prosecutors to prosecute corruption, even the new courts that were created under the new anti-corruption system. Those judges have to be trained. You need all of these types of specialists. That's a not only a difficult task and somewhat of a time-consuming task, but it's a rather boring task. I mean, it's not. It doesn't have a high political profile. So a lot of the things that have to be done for the new anti-corruption system to work will take time, and it will be kind of a slow process. So it doesn't necessarily fit into perhaps the demands that the people want something quickly, and so that's one of the challenges, I think. Well, the second challenge, particularly because of the national anti-corruption reform, and particularly the role that civil society played in, López Obrador really needs to coordinate the anti-corruption campaign with civil society organizations. So this is a big challenge because it requires, I think, a different style of leadership than what we're accustomed to seeing by Mexican presidents. Mexican presidents have been able to determine largely what goes on with the government, and they've dealt with a relatively weak civil society. But in this case, when we're talking about anti-corruption, López Obrador now will face more autonomous organizations like the Federation Auditors, Freedom of Information, INAI, more autonomous INE of the Electoral Commission, the Attorney General's office now that should be more autonomous. And within the Fiscalia, you have a special prosecutor for anti-corruption. So even within the government, López Obrador has to recognize the autonomy of these organizations and their role in fighting corruption. He's not going to be able to control those. And in many ways, the same goes with civil society. Now you have civil society organizations that are much stronger than they were in the past. It's going to be a challenge for the government to be able to work with them, not try to control or manipulate them, and know that they are going to exert pressure on the government to fight corruption. They're going to expose corruption. They're going to follow up on reports. So they're going to play the role that civil society is supposed to play in providing, in ensuring accountability on the part of the government. So that's a big challenge. The literature is quite clear that you need, public support, you need autonomous organizations within the government, and you need a very active and engaged civil society. And, what makes Mexico unique is that we have all of those right now. And how they play out and how they play together, I guess, is part of the issue as to what might be the outcome of this anti-corruption drive.
Right. So I wanted to ask you about that. So in looking at the four elements that you mentioned as necessary to fight corruption, I think I agree that all four elements are present in Mexico right now. But I am not sure if they're present in a way that they can coexist and reinforce each other, or in ways that are perhaps destructive. And so I would like to get your thoughts on this. So, like, López Obrador has been talking about corruption for a long time, right? He claiming that he can solve this problem, that his integrity alone at times can solve this problem. And as I discussed with Jacqueline Bechard, it seems like he sees this not as an institutional problem with institutional solutions, but as a moral problem with moral solutions. Yeah. And I'm wondering if this, combined with his animosity towards civil society organizations and the media, right? He calls them fifi, like kind of this elite privileged class. Yeah. I wonder if these elements can actually play together, or if they will destroy each other.
Well, I mean, that's certainly the part of the risk involved here, and the honesty is not going to fix the problem, and you're not going to be given the nature of corruption. Corruption quite often is a rational choice that most people make to engage in corruption. So it's not easy to fix through some type of moral education. The honesty is important in the sense that it gains credibility for López Obrador, his honesty, and I think that's quite proven that if he were involved in any type of corrupt activities, it certainly would probably have been exposed by now. So his honesty is important in terms of providing a certain degree of moral leadership for the country and providing an important moral leadership for his team and fighting corruption. So I think that's important, but obviously some type of moral education or moral conversion is not going to happen, and it's not nearly enough to try to address corruption. So you have to have, obviously, institutional changes and structural changes. Some of those institutional changes are already in motion as a result of the National Anti-Corruption System. So they've got something to build on there. I agree with the issue, even though I stand by the notion that an active and engaged civil society is important, and it's not going to go away. So you have to learn to work with civil society organizations. It is somewhat of a concern, his move on defunding civil society organizations. By the same token, in the past, one of the concerns has always been in Mexico how the government uses its funding of organizations within society to control those organizations, kind of the corporatist type of structure and patron clientelism that goes way back in Mexico. These organizations are not going to disappear. They're built into the system in some way through the Citizenship Committee that actually rules over the coordinating committee of the National Anti-Corruption System, so they're involved. And I think their approach, thinking of Irma Sandoval and even others who are part of his anti-corruption team in Mexico, they recognize and acknowledge the role that civil society has to play and how citizen participation is important. But they have to come at that from the context of this is not something that can be controlled or dictated or manipulated by the central government. But I think López Obrador, that moral the moral appeal that he has is very important because people are not going to be involved in anti-corruption if they're not convinced that the government is serious about it. And I think people understand that he is serious about trying to fight corruption, and that's why he enjoys such high levels of approval at this point. And I think somewhere or another, he has to try to sustain that support by engaging the public in this fight against corruption. And just asking people to be honest is certainly not going to do the trick. You have to have these institutional and structural reforms.
Right. So lastly, I wanted to ask if your view on this has changed at all since the issue brief came out at the beginning of March. López Obrador doesn't really seem to favor the National Anti-Corruption System, or like he kind of is incredulous of civil society, as we said. And most recently, there was a constitutional reform introduced in the Senate by Ricardo Monreal, a Morena senator, that would kind of create this new chamber or sala in the Supreme Court to address corruption cases, and it would increase the number of justices from 11 to 16. So how do you interpret moves like this, and does it make you think that perhaps this historic opportunity will be wasted? And pardon me if I sound too pessimistic.
No, there are matters of concern, but also I feel somewhat. I see aspects of concern, but also aspects that kind of support a more optimistic approach. Particularly judging from some of the activities of his team, I think some of the reforms and some of the issues that we see are certainly on the right track. There's a mixture of things that raise some red flags and then a number of issues that I think that they're moving forward on. And I think the team is doing as much as they can in such a short period of time. Again, I think it's not something that can be fixed in the short term. The problem quite often with politics is to satisfy the public or to satisfy the media. You want to have some high-profile types of measures that shows that you're fighting corruption. But a lot of what they have to do is kind of slow, tedious state capacity building work, which takes some time. There is a new court system to deal with corruption. So once that gets up and running, then hopefully they'll be able to begin to process more cases. And the more cases they're able to prosecute, the more it sends out the signal to politicians and to bureaucrats and even members of society that perhaps the game is changing. And as the game changes, that changes the culture. And so people begin to worry that being involved in corrupt acts could bring severe consequences. And that's what changes the rationale, the expectations and the rationale of the people. And that's kind of more important than just preaching honesty. But honesty is important. It's an important value. But quite often, honesty is a value that is nurtured through these arrangements. And so yeah, I see some positive signs and some signs of concern.
Well, Stephen Morris, I think we'll leave with that hopeful note. Thank you so much for answering these questions.
My pleasure. Okay.
That was Stephen Morris. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Lisa Wakata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Mexico Center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at mexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. I will see you next time.